Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about a big problem that we have, I think, and others think, which is a simple fact that we have a global food system that is destroying a lot more than it creates or it produces, and it manifests in different ways. It's been costed out at $15 trillion a year, the damage due to this dysfunctional system. There are other manifestations and consequences. For example, 1 in 3 of all people on the planet are malnourished in some form, whether that's overweight, obesity, undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies. We have around about 12 million adult deaths every year due to unhealthy diets and or malnutrition. That's 1 million a month, actually 1 every 2 seconds. We have, in this country, we have it's costed out around about 268 billion pounds a year damage consequences of our unhealthy diet. And that manifests as 2/3 of that falls directly on individuals and households in the form of ill health, premature death, in the form of lost productivity, sick days. There are sick days epidemics. The other third of that 268 billion pounds a year falls on the NHS welfare social services. The NHS budget is around 190 billion pounds a year. So you see the kind of the mismatch and the disconnect between that. It's a huge burden that falls upon us, and it falls on many countries, most countries in the world in some forms. And that's because what we have right now is a food system that was designed in a different century for a different purpose. It was actually built after the Second World War to mass-produce cheap calories, to prevent famine, and also with the overproduction that later ensued with the Green Revolution, the overproduction through a strategic use of food aid was used to buffer the West from the spread of communism. And then over the last, I think, around 50 years of neoliberalism, food has been viewed less and less as a basic need and a human right and much more as a commodity. And what that means, and as a handful of transnational corporations have moved in and effectively captured this food system. And we see this at every stage from production through to consumption, just a handful. And if we look down at the global retail side, if you like, the consumer side, although I don't particularly like the word consumer, we'll come to that, we see 5 companies: Nestlé, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Unilever, General Mills, that control 75% of global retail. If we look upstream in terms of land use, in terms of agribusiness, it's Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, ADM, and Bunge, who control up to 90% of global grain trade. And we see that across the board at every stage. Different companies, but in each case, at least 75% of whatever is happening, whatever activity, whatever is being produced, being controlled by just 4 or 5 companies. In the UK, when we look at supermarkets, or we look at store-bought food in the UK, we see Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison controlling 70%. So this is not a healthy situation. And the big problem the big problem with that corporate capture and that hyper-concentration across the board is the simple fact that these companies are aiming to maximize profit, and they do that through producing ultra-processed foods which are the least healthy for us as humans and least healthy for our planet. So we have a major disconnect. We have a food system that is no longer producing whole foods to nourish people. It is producing raw ingredients for industrial processes that lead to a myriad of ultra-processed products. It is producing cattle feed that end up as meat and dairy. It also produces biofuels for cars, but it doesn't produce whole foods for humans. So when we talk about the damage, when we talk about the products, if you like, I won't call them foods. So a lot of the ultra-processed products are really fake foods. So I'm going to take a step back and go back to the early 90s. I worked in Geneva, early 90s, 35 years ago, with various colleagues looking at undernutrition across the world. One of those brilliant guys I worked with was a Brazilian scientist, Carlos Monteiro. Carlos was doing a case study of Brazil. He was digging into the reasons why, or the success story of Brazil in driving down rates of child undernutrition and stunting. We wrote a great case study, but he was worried. He seemed to be really concerned about things changing rapidly in his country, in Brazil, due to various products and foods flooding in from the north due to a free trade deal. And long story short, the other thing he did, he looked at dietary surveys. And he said, there's something odd happening, even though the levels of fat, salt, and sugar in the diet in Brazil were not particularly changing that very particularly. What was changing was overweight and obesity among kids. And the type of foods and the products were coming in were much more processed. So he had this hunch that it was something to do with the processing, the ultra-processing of these products that was driving obesity in Brazil. Long story short, he came up with a classification system called NOVA. NOVA differentiated different foods into different categories. The last category, category 4, NOVA 4, were ultra-processed products. And these are hyperpalatable, they're highly energy dense, they're high fat, salt, sugar, they are easily stored, they have long shelf lives. They're also addictive, or quasi-addictive. The levels of addiction have been shown, even in MRIs, to be equivalent to that of tobacco and alcohol. And so we have and there's a whole new vocabulary around these types of products, like Bliss Point, Flavor Burst, Mouthfeel, which capture the essence of the potential damage of these products. So what he did with the scientists was to set up a series of studies to look at whether there was anything in this hunch of the ultra-processors being the problem. And that was shown and has been shown over the last 20 years in hundreds of studies. Ultra-processing confers a whole series of problems that manifest in high levels of obesity, high levels of diabetes, mental ill health, and we have this problem on our hands. The other part of this, the big part of the problem is these products are responsible for over 80 to 90% of the diets in terms of calories of most people in this country, in the US, and many other countries in Europe. They are also about 90% of what is produced by the big 10 food companies in the world. So this is all skewed towards maximizing profit at all costs. The costs being paid by us, being paid also by the planet. Food system that we have is driving a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. It's driving rapid deforestation. Plastic pollution, most of these products are wrapped in plastic. Plastic pollution is off the scale. There are around about 5 single-use plastic bottles for every person on the planet floating in the oceans. McDonald's alone produces 1 billion kilos of plastic a year. That's the weight of 200 Eiffel Towers. Every one of us has plastic in most of our organs in our body, including our brains, up to 7 grams. We know that does affect, especially among children, this is a big issue because they've longer to live in terms of behavior and cognition. So we have what has been called a broken food system. I don't agree with that. Because the system is doing exactly what it's been designed to do. What we have is the wrong food system. And what that means is we cannot continue this notion of tinkering at the margins, tweaking, incremental changes, piecemeal approaches. We need a radical overhaul of our food system to turn it over time, and it will take time, into one that puts people first, puts the planet first, and rather than profit. I should also say that with these big food companies, they're also under huge pressure from above through hedge funds and asset management firms like BlackRock, State Capital, Vanguard, who have been buying up shares in the companies to drive that what's called shareholder primacy and the focus on profit. And they vote out any measures to improve the healthiness of the portfolios of these companies. So we have this big problem. So there's a market capture. We have to look at it in terms of power, and power can be used in many different forms for many different purposes. We have market power, financial power on the part of these companies, big food, but they're so big they can turn that into political power. When through various devices, various tricks and tactics, when I started to write, this book a couple of years ago, Food Fight, 23 chapters. Chapter 13 is called The Dark Arts. Chapter 13 was the first chapter I wrote, and later I decided to write a book. That is the corporate playbook, really, in terms of the ways in which companies translate market and financial power into political power. I generated a list of deadly Ds, so we have, and I'm just going to list some of them out: dispute, doubt, distort, distract, disguise, dodge. These are all ways in which, and I'll explain one or two of those, the ways in which companies influence policy, infiltrate political processes, block politicians from acting against their interests. So, disputes. And a lot of this comes from tobacco. It comes from the old tobacco playbook. The first one is sowing doubt, whereby, especially in the 60s, big tobacco realized it couldn't any longer challenge the evidence of the harms of smoking. So it decided to set about strategically, systematically, to buy scientists, to pay their salaries, to fund university departments, to generate a raft of studies that cast doubt on the potential harms of smoking. They made sure that advisory bodies were rife or flooded with these particular scientists. The exact same thing now is happening with ultra-processed foods. Even now, in this country, with a new national food strategy, Henry Dimbleby tried it 4 years ago. That was kicked out by Sunak's and Johnson's government. As we know, it's coming back. There is a food strategy board, which unfortunately, yet again, has huge conflicts of interest on the part of many of its members, including McCain's Crisps being in charge of discussions leading to policy on our food system. Why? They shouldn't be there. These companies should be nowhere near the political process. They should be nowhere near policy development. But that's the situation we have. Why do we have this constant roadblock? A large part of it is this ridiculous notion and fear on the part of politicians of being too nanny-statist about everything. Everyone should have the freedom to buy what they want. The problem with that argument, it just doesn't hold up. It never has. If you look at all the various ways in which public health policy has been protected by governments, as it should, being the largest development agency in the country, you see it in terms of the fact that kids can't buy cigarettes, they can't buy alcohol, you see it through seatbelts, fluoridation of water, sewage standards, sanitation standards, shatterproof glass in showers. All of these are measures proactively, and you can't have asbestos in the walls. All of these are measures proactively taken by governments to protect public health. Junk food, ultra-processed food, kills a lot more than any one of those problems, and we still have the standing. I think it's changing a little bit, but there's still a large amount of standing off in terms of politicians proactively acting to regulate the industry, and that's what we need. And as I say, we need a radical overhaul. I believe that can be a real transformation. That word transformation has been kicked around a lot by a lot of people who are not interested in transformation. So this is another part of the problem, which is the ways in which language has been appropriated. We've seen that with climate. Fossil fuel companies talking about carbon footprints, which is individualizing something which is an industrial, has an industrial source. Litterbug, that was always there in terms of, again, blaming the individual. The same thing happens with the food industry. It blames consumers for not exercising enough and for eating the wrong things or too much of the wrong things, when our food environments are absolutely saturated with harmful products. There is even new evidence now that you don't even need to consume some of this stuff to fire up addictive centers in your brain. This is a bit like the passive smoking findings. So if you live in an environment where you walk out the door and all you see are Burger Kings or fast food joints or shops, and even so-called coffee shops that sell mainly ultra-processed products, it fires up the addictive pathways in your brain potentially, and that kind of evidence is getting stronger and stronger. So again, the government will be forced to act. What can we do? what should they do? I think there is a role for every actor that's involved in the food system in some way. The biggest role really has to be on the part of the single most important development or health food agency in the country, which is the government. And I talk about 4 Ins in the book. The first is institutions. The government has enormous power to protect public health through procuring healthy foods and healthy diets for hospitals, for clinics, for schools. School feeding is a big deal, and it's extremely beneficial not only for nutrition of kids, for their brain development, for their ability to stay in school, their ability to concentrate, and the long-term intergenerational impacts of having a proper full education are clear. That's the first in, institution. The second in is incentives, and there we can look at the ways in which governments can and should be taxing harmful products. We have a polluter pays approach with climate. We should have a similar thing, or we should have, and we should have a similar thing with regard to harmful products and practices. But importantly, as well as so we have sugar tax on drinks. We should go a lot further than that. In Colombia, they have junk food tax. It works. We are seeing all wherever it's been tried out, we start to see the benefits in reduction of purchases of those products, begins to see the slowing in the growth rate of obesity in these countries. But importantly, use the tax dividend that governments will gain from that, and use that potentially to subsidize the purchase of healthy diets on the part of low-income families. So you're leveling the playing field, or the fiscal seesaw, in favor of a healthier diet for the population. The third in is information, and there we're talking about governments regulating commercial promotion of unhealthy foods, especially baby foods. We also labeling of foods, ensuring that dietary guidance is being set by independent scientists who are focusing on the health of people, and without conflict of interest in terms of the way those advisory bodies operate. The fourth in is interests, and that's cleaning up lobbying. I did some work with the Food Foundation earlier this year that led to a report called The Dark Side of the Plate. It's available online. We looked at the last 5 years of lobbying meetings held with government ministers, and found that there were 35 meetings held on food or health with public interest NGOs and government ministers, compared to 1,305 with big food. It's a 40-fold difference. Where are we now? Sunday. Monday, tomorrow's Guardian is going to be a big article that shines a light on the systematic attempt, successful, to block the government through aggressive lobbying to avoid ever seeing the word ultra-processing in any dietary guidance. That's been gleaned from Freedom of Information requests, and it's taken 6 months for that investigation. It'll be out tomorrow. So cleaning up lobbying, we need proper disclosure why lobbying happens, what's the purpose of the meeting, what are the outcomes of the meeting. That's government, 4 ins. And by the way, I should also say, a lot of discussion, as we all know, about GLP-1 agonist weight loss jabs. These are important treatments for those who need them, but like any other disease or a major public health condition, we need treatment, therapies, but we need large-scale prevention. It does not obviate the need to deal with the saturated environments, unhealthy food environments that we have in the country. That's governments. But also what we found is there's fantastic work being done by a lot of cities through city mayors. Actually, London's one. Brighton is another in this country. I looked at 2 examples in Brazil. There's a chapter called A Tale of 4 Cities in the book. But all over the world, there is a group called the Milan Pact, and they now have 200 members. They're all connected. There are examples and success stories of, across the world in terms of the way in which municipalities, city administrations are managing to, with their power that they hold, to ensure as far as possible a healthy food environment in cities. Citizens is I won't call them consumers, citizens, many examples, both in terms of individual agency, collective agency, in the book. Haven't got time to go into them. Eglantine Jebb is a fantastic example from 110 years ago. She was the founder of Save the Children Fund. There was a brilliant story about a farmer in France, José Bové, in 1999, who bulldozed a McDonald's restaurant. He later became an MP. And then there's a fantastic story about a young Kenyan woman called Wawira Njuro, who went and did a master's in Australia on nutrition, came back, went back to a very poor area outside Nairobi in Kenya where she lived, set up in an old tin shack, a corrugated iron shack, a school feeding program that led over time to her being responsible for feeding 25 million school meals to kids. The government has taken it on board now, and they're going to universalize it across Kenya in the next 4 years. These are citizens changing things. We need the media to be much more proactive and to focus in on deep dive stories, both of the problems, but also, and importantly, the solutions. Research. I'm nearly finished. Research. There's a brilliant quote in the book I read 50 years ago, 1976. The book is called How the Other Half Dies. It's a fantastic book, and it's by Susan George, who's a political scientist, who said, we spend too long looking at the powerless and the oppressed. We need to focus on what is going on with those who hold power, shine a light on them, and I think that also applies in terms of research that's needed. Industry will follow. It will have to follow. If we start pushing on all these levers, pressing the buttons with all these different actors, industry will follow. Every action or set of actions that need to be taken will look different in different places, obviously depending on the context, depending on the problem. But the last thing I will say is the one overarching area of focus, I think, should be on children and their children. So the intergenerational focus is key in any advocacy. I think we need a big conversation about what a food system is for, with that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much.